I'm Tammy Lea Meyer, and it's my honor and pleasure to explore Helene Finidori's work. Uh, Helene and I met in 2015 at the Next Edge conference in Montreal. And this process has been birthed from many years of my own development, but also a collaborative, co-creative work that a group of us with the Global Challenges collaboration have been forming. And so it's my first opportunity to really do the deeper work that we wrote a proposal for the Global Challenges Foundation. So we submitted at the end of September, but it is my first opportunity to really kick the tires in this new form and frame. So I'm really, really grateful for you to be here to explore this, Helene.
Well, I'm glad to be your first guest to speak after this big enterprise that mobilized lots of people and lots of energy, but also lots of interesting and, potential in there.
Yes. So I'll speak a little bit about the purpose of these dialogues. For me, it is to create some space for us to share our work. So many people all over the world, yourself included, have been thinking for years, decades, about how to meet the challenges of the world today in very specific ways. And I have the sense that there is a beautiful metastructure that exists between us. And this is a way for us to be able to explore each other's work and to share it with others so that it can be seen, heard, co-developed with others, and we can better understand what we can actually take action on. So to begin, I would love to have you do a little overview on your journey towards what you're doing now. Maybe you can just start with the seed of where you kind of began with this so that we can get a sense of where you started.
Okay, well, actually, I come from a business background. I studied business and I started in marketing. And I was in a medium-sized company that was manufacturing and selling household packagings and garbage bags. And I got actually very, very attracted by the waste and the garbage side of things rather than the, food, consumer goods aspects. And I got involved quite early in all discussions about preservation of resources and preserving plastics and recycling of waste, etc. And then in the meantime, I got some twins, and my view started to shift, from the businesswoman to the mother, and becoming more and more concerned with other things than just being successful in my job and doing well in this kind of environment. And when my third child was born, well, my husband had an opportunity to move around the world to go and work in Indonesia, so I followed him. And I've been following in different countries for the past 20 years. So it's the sixth country where I'm in now. And in every country where I found myself, I tried to work on a like pro bono voluntary basis in some of the things that were the most striking in this country. So I arrived in Indonesia at a time where it was like booming and soaring, but a year later there was this huge monetary crisis with devaluation and lots of problems. And I started to get involved. I was involved in two things. One was a community association that was raising funds to keep kids in school. students, and another one was a cultural organization. And because there was at the same time a change of regime, and the Suharto dictatorial regime had fallen, it was an interesting cultural transition, because people had started to speak up and to be very, you would see activism getting more present. So that was a first slice where I started to get interested in movements and changes and transitions. And then we moved to Sweden. And when I arrived in Sweden, it was in 99, boom of the internet, and Scandinavian countries were roaring, and the laboratory for all, the WAPs and the telecom and the internet, and they were all, the best ones, and testing, and, Razorfish and FramFab and all these huge companies. And I started working in as a consultant in trying to see how these companies could, spin off and find partnerships in France, etc. And that crashed and burned. But I had the opportunity to get a foot into IT and technology because of that. And when it crashed and burned, I found myself, and that was interesting, because at the time in France, there was a guy called Alexandre Jardin who was trying to give a greater role to civil society in politics. And he wrote a book called 1 + 1 + 1 is the Revolution. And he wanted to create observatories of real people, let's say, who would take, record good practices, good social practices, and reproduce them. So it was maybe the first seed of patterns that I got kind of came across them, and I decided that I would look at how things would be working in Sweden, that they were known for the Swedish model, and I realized that the Swedish model was not an actual set of economic measures or social rules or laws, but it was a way of looking at problems, and a way of consultation and some form of participatory. So I can imagine Swedish people saying, well, no, it's not like that, that's the dream, etc. But I think that there were seeds in there, even if it was not exactly, what we would dream of, but there was more of a systemic thinking over there in taking and tackling challenges. And there was more of a consultation of what people, engaging the people in decisions. And so I started writing at that time and trying to find examples. And then we moved to Chicago. And moving to Chicago was at a time just after the Iraq war had started. So French people were not very well greeted, let's say. And so, my time in the US, where I started the seeds of another type of different types of discourses that were going on in the States. And so that's where I started with internet blogging and social networks, etc. And then I moved to Australia, Sydney. And I had the opportunity to meet the whole bunch of Gathering 11 people, Melbourne and Sydney and everyone there. And that's where I met lots of people from the Next Edge, actually. And the Next Edge was created by many of the people who were there in Melbourne. Nice. So at that time, I was really happy to have internet, because I had... it was difficult to socially get integrated in every country where I had moved. So that was a kind of an effort, let's say, that I made to try really and connect with local people. But I still had a large family to connect with on, let's say, maybe things that I was more in phase with, or more systematically in phase with, and start reflecting and meeting you and the whole, the whole crew, networks of networks, where we're all having, a few feet in this one or that one. And so from there, the peer-to-peer foundation and the We Share community and Sensorica and creating the Commons Abundance Network. So I've been really, let's say, to qualify and to make the story short, because I've been speaking for quite a long time, but jumping from one culture to another, from one sector to another, from one issue to another, from one language to another, kind of became very, very obvious to me that first, I didn't know exactly where I belonged. That's for the personal aspect of it. But then this urge to try and, pull threads and connect dots and get people to meet or cross-pollinate ideas. And that's where this bumblebee or, butterfly type of let's say, way of doing things and working started. And so I have actually a foot in many, many different initiatives and projects, but I'm never dedicated enough to kind of accomplish something in one of them, because I'm in many of them. But I guess my role is to go from one to the other and to try and pull things together. And so I've been trying to find for a very long time, and that's probably because of my background in branding, because what I was kind of very interested in my business life, let's say, was the branding part and the organizational part. And I already had some systemic view of it, like, why do you invest everything here and nothing here? Because there's a missing link. What you need to see things, and the sum of the parts is, the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. But there was also this coming from the branding aspect, and especially business to business branding, that people don't speak or understand the same language, and that there are two things. There's the positioning that you have when you're in a business in relation to the positions of others, whether it's competitors or customers or people inside the company. And there's this, how do you have a let's say, communication or identity strategy so that you attract your customers and you satisfy your stakeholders and people are happy to work for your company. So, for example, in Australia, I had the opportunity to work for a very small business-to-business boutique that was doing exactly that and was picking the clients with interesting. So with this background, I was really interested to say, well, if you're interested in social change or societal change, and you realize that most of that is a communication or a worldview or a perspective problem, what strategies can you have to align people? Because this is the first reflex that people say is, let's all get aligned. So how do you align people so it's easy in a company or in a homogeneous organization? Because it's an attractor in itself. So people who are there, well, they're there to create their rules and their missions and their visions, and they usually manage to get a consensus and agree. But how can you do that in an open system where everybody comes from somewhere different? And so the big thing has been grand narratives.
Mm.
So how can you create a grand narrative for others to rally around? And well, that's not even obvious. So at one point, and that's where I started with the commons, is that with discussing with Michel Bowens and all the people in the community of the commons, and they were starting to work on the idea that the commons could be a federative concept to draw all kinds of different communities together. And that's where I started thinking that, well, maybe they could be some form of let's say a framing of the idea of the commons that could be fuzzy enough so that everybody would recognize that part of commons, and to say, well, my part of commons is a piece of the bigger part of the commons. But trying to do that, and going to Berlin at the economics of the, economy and the commons forum, etc., I realized that even the people in the commons couldn't agree on a definition of a commons and a strategy to bring their piece of the commons together, etc., etc. I mean, they're doing it, but that's when I kind of thought that maybe we needed something more than a grand narrative and a big story, and that we probably needed something more technological. And that's when I came with my small bits and my patterns, because I thought it was a granular way to kind of look at things, both from a small and a big perspective. So basically, this is how I arrived to, from, let's say, environment and, big ideas of changing the planet, to more focus on the commons, and then focusing even more on the code, on the small elements.
Wow. It's so exciting for me to hear the stories of what brings people to the work, because it makes it very human, right? It's like, and then you had twins. That's exciting.
Yeah. They are 27 years old, almost 28.
That's
yeah,
wonderful.
That doesn't make me younger.
So patterns and pattern language. Maybe you could just do a little bit of an explanation for those who might not be familiar with patterns and pattern language.
Yes, and when I'm asked this question, it's always a problem, because I don't know if I need to start with patterns or to start with pattern languages, because depending on who I'm talking with, I have a different response. I think that in our communities, well, there are two types of communities. In the communities of techies, let's say that the pattern, it comes first, and that's what powers, artificial intelligence and the recognition and the deep learning, etc. But when you talk to more designers and social designers and even architects, well, the pattern it has been embedded in the notion of a pattern language, and the pattern language is something that has been, let's say, initiated by Christopher Alexander, who was an architect and who tried to capture the, let's say, the tacit ways that the ancient people would build for thousands of years. They didn't need to follow a book. They didn't need to study architecture or engineering. They just built it, and they knew how to create aliveness and alive places, etc. And Christopher Alexander tried to capture this in what he called pattern language, which was trying to capture the concepts or the forms that were not really very defined, but more sets of principles, like if you want to feel comfortable, well, if your window is there, your door must be there so that, there's a circulation, etc. I don't know them exactly well enough to give a very, very
An example.
faithful example, so and for each pattern, there's what patterns are associated to it, and the idea was that by combining all these patterns, you would create spaces and living spaces that could generate some other forms of relationships and ways of living.
Yes.
And so it has remained pretty confidential in architecture, but it took off really, really well in object programming, in software programming, as a design tool, because the pattern in pattern language, and this is something that I'm researching a little bit more, actually has a problem and some forces that are related to the problem in a context and the solution attached to it. And so this was really interesting for the programmers, because especially in human computer interaction or interface problematics, they would be able to reference some typical issues that were coming up and create these blocks or objects that could be used to solve these recurring problems. I'm looking at patterns. I'm trying actually to go back to the actual potential of the pattern. And this is what actually Christopher Alexander was drawing from, is that the pattern is something that is immanent and that people have within themselves, like some form of embodied knowledge, but has also its correspondence in also what you can see and draw from the world around you. So you have patterns in the world, patterns of, the way an eagle or a hawk is going to fly, the tracks of a bison, or how the clouds gather, or all kinds of natural patterns, phenomena. Then you have patterns of how people behave, and you have patterns of how, people circulate and traffic jams. And so you can see and detect patterns and recognize patterns, both as structural, like static, and dynamic in what you observe from the world. But you also have patterns in the way people observe things and describe things. So you have the patterns in the mind and the models that people create that are patterns also. And you also have the patterns that people produce to communicate either on what they have in their mind or what they see in the outside. And this is what I kind of connect to the semiotic dimension of the pattern. And I'd really like to draw on this to actually use this, let's say, multifaceted characteristic of the pattern to interrelate these different dimensions. So, and this relates to the conversation that we had when we were in Montreal about this why, how, and what, that we came to describe some of the work that some of us had done on the patterns, and trying to find micro, like systemic interpretation patterns that could help us mark up lots of different things, and realizing that when we were talking about something and describing a project, well, when we were talking about what we were doing, some people were expecting us to say why we were doing it, or were frustrated because there was only the object there and not the kind of internal, motivation and the human or people aspect or yeah, drive associated to us, and others were saying, yes, but how do you do this? And so this is where I kind of started looking at it as saying, well, that pattern that connect, maybe that this triadic nature of the pattern could actually help describe the what and look at the why. I mean, get people together to co-explore their whys, their hows, and their whats, using patterns as objects of study, or we can call that boundary objects, that could actually serve almost as a research object that people could, and we could imagine recording the controversies and the alignments and non-alignments, etc. So this is where I'd like to put the definition of the pattern. That was a big long definition.
But there's so much. I mean, part of what you're saying, just in terms of how things are being received, is that people have a sense of the wholeness. And if you're only presenting a part of the wholeness, anyone listening or participating can be like, oh, you're missing this bit. And I feel like that pattern of sensing wholeness is something that's an overarching human pattern.
Yes.
That we've been actually nudged, to use one of your terms, out of, in the way that the world seems to work, in terms of, the corporate world hiving off our attention, and the ways that narratives are presenting, talking about them, not about we. And we're taught, even in terms of today with our cell phones, there's this kind of separateness in the form of connection, and it's but I don't think there's any way to quash the human pattern to see the whole and feel the whole. So there's this interesting dissonance that exists today, that I think it's an interesting exploration in itself.
Well, what I like in my craziest dreams, what I envision some form of, I don't know, technology, or I don't know how you call it, where you can envision yourself and your activity in the middle of the rest, like positioning. Yeah. Now with Google Maps or Google Earth, we know exactly where we are, even in the universe. We know where we live. We know on which floor. I mean, couldn't we have this, like in the knowledge and the action space, and navigate in there?
Yes.
And being glad, you talk about presence, to say, well, I'm holding this space and I'm being effective in my space, in what I'm doing as a contribution to the whole. And I know what others are doing, and I know where the whole is going. And so, well, probably this tool, or whatever you can call it, can be built one day. And I think maybe the pattern that connect a small bit can be the atom, or the unit, or the interoperable thing that can help throw hooks or connect things together in a kind of great graph where people could circulate and navigate and explore the things that are actually the closest to them. Because some people really like to, experience things that are out there and have radical change experiences. But most of the people feel comfortable in smaller steps. And so smaller steps, well, we could be tempted to say, change is never incremental, and so don't think about smaller steps. Think of radical change, think of paradigm change, think of things that really will change things. But worldviews and paradigms, they move, they evolve, and there's a kind of a collective movement of how the collective worldview or the things are shifting. So if people can start exploring through things that they feel more comfortable about in some direction of a radical change, then maybe we can elicit some more exploration and change. So it's all this area that I'd like to explore and to see how it can be tooled. So you were talking about, you know, the economy of attention and things like that. Well, all these tools to actually look at the patterns of what's going on, you know, the power, the aggregations, the accumulations, they exist, but they're used to be turned against, you know, against the diffuse many. They used to nudge us towards consuming, towards voting in a certain direction, or towards, you know, getting us addicted to all kinds of stuff.
And I would add, there's a bit of an element of the panopticon, right?
Exactly. So how do you reverse that? And how do you use these tools or create open source tools that, you know, that can bring these black boxes inside out, so that you can actually expose a certain number of things, because many people really don't know what's going on. For example, if you take in high frequency trading, well, it was all about, it was a mechanical thing. Well, first you can argue about when it's a machine that does a financial transaction, where is the you know, where is the adjustment of the interests of the player, when it's not a human that decides, you know, on rational basis to make an investment and a transaction. But then pushing the thing further with the machine generated transaction is that the developers of the high frequency trading were looking at accelerating the time for orders to get in and the reaction, and it was a matter of the chip. It was the matter of the speed of the actual hardware that could almost enable to get an information about what the people that were closer to the source of the information had given as a transaction order, to anticipate on the order and bet and beat them on the. So it's actually a trick. It's actually beating it's actually a totally manipulative, mechanical thing that was going on. So how can you expose these types of things? There's also in the finance area field, Brett Scott, who wrote a book on hacking the finance system. And so he suggests, so he promotes the attitude, you know, the good hacking attitude, you know, how to break something down in order to keep the good pieces and understand how the dynamics and the structures of it works to build something new that serves the system or the people better. But he was saying that you actually, so the people, let's say we the people or the community, come across this huge finance system that is totally rogue and, you know, overshoots and brings everybody down. But nobody, I mean, the dissenting voice is all scattered and distributed and diffuse, and nobody comes with one possible course of action. And nobody knows how to pinpoint where the problem actually is. Well, this is the type of stuff that we need to be able to be doing, is to expose the massive things here so that we can collectively more share, let's say, the task or the work of coming against a certain number of things. And when things are exposed, well, people kind of understand better that it's not fate, you know, it's not, maybe there are things to be done.
So just to jump in there, I would love to share an idea of a collective intervention that I think could shift everything, just in terms of financial systems. And I'll also preface that I do sit on the board of a small credit union here in what's known as Vancouver. And so I think that if we created a international credit union, that every person on the planet had access to, that it was a fundamental right or access that was given to every human being. If we owned the financial system that created transactions, all of that benefit could go directly to humanity rather than being something that corporations harvest from us. It would give us an opportunity to be able to design an economic system that would work and work for everyone. So, you know, I know it's kind of a big idea. And at the same time, I think that it makes sense. We all know that the banks are a problem, that there's been a economic development that has been not thoughtful. It has just sort of happened over the course of the last couple hundred years. And it's not been thoughtfully created. And I feel that with the good minds that we are, we can, that's where I would shed a light, is if we owned the system of exchange, as well as designed a system of value creation, which is a whole other aspect that has not been thoughtfully designed or developed, that we could shift pretty much everything.
I think that if we understand, and I say the mechanics, and we mustn't use mechanistic vocabulary when talking of systems, but it is a form of a mechanic that, you know, aggregation of things creates some pressure or creates some acceleration or some movement. And so by understanding how things currently work, so the patterns that we want to change, and then trying to define the patterns that we want to create, then if we define how we get from A to B and how we transition, like we talked this morning, I think that we could use patterns for this. And even if patterns is not like, you know, modeling and systems dynamics, where you put your whole thing into a model and you press run and then it tells you how it will all work out. No, I think we have to take it more like elements of inquiry. What happens, that's a question of having something that's continuous, like a systems dynamic model, and having something discrete, where you have one element that you add to another element and you say, hey, what happens if you add this to that? And if you aggregate this, and if you put this type of orientation. And so you can interrogate and question each association and each relation. And then maybe in the end, you can create a nice, you know, a real actual model that you can run. But the fact of using discrete elements can help you make scenarios probably in a more, let's say, participatory and understanding way. Because if you put a systems dynamic model in front of anyone, you see circles and cycles and pluses and minuses everywhere, and you say, hey, where do I enter here? Mm-hmm. Where do I start? So patterns can help, do a kind of adaptive modeling of what we have, what we want, and how we can get from here to there, and maybe help, let's say, extract the major patterns that kind of cut across all these things, like extraction patterns or accumulation patterns or overheat, over applied positive feedback loops or things like that, and show different examples of how it applies. Because one thing that you don't mention in your project, and that many, I think, is left aside, is that once that you or all these our big minds will have come up with a great solutions and a new pattern, how does your pattern live and evolve? Because I think we must not forget that capitalism and business as we're doing it started from the corporation was the merchant, and was a way for people who were not the aristocrats and to kind of mutualize their resources to create an activity. And sometimes you can wonder whether some of the peer-to-peer spirit could not be found at that time in the medieval cities. And so the problem is how these systems that were working well when they were conceived, how did they scale, but how did the aggregate effects of what they generated scaled, and what did it generate as structures and as dynamics that actually take a life on its own? And even the people who did create the system anyway, even the people within the system, they are totally powerless and they don't know how to change it, because the whole thing is moving, and how do you change that? So I think it's very important when we create new things to embed inside it the systems that can help assess how it's going to evolve in time. It's like Bitcoin or blockchain. How are these, zillions of contracts that apparently, if we hear Arthur Brock, that are, are going to kind of freeze into some kind of centralized consensus? How is this going to create, huge emergent centralized powers? Mm-hmm. So all these are things that we need to take into account, and to give some form of literacy to people and people who want to change things, to be and even everyone, every kid, how do you recognize a sign that well, your medicine, if you take just enough, it's great, but if you take too much, you become poisoned. And so, if we're in a system where when someone finds a solution, wow, so great, bam, we're going to incentive the application and the adoption of the solution, and we're going to create aggregation of the solution to accelerate the feedback loops that is going to scale the solution. But never are we going to set up systems that are going to say, hey, now the solution is not a solution anymore, it becomes a problem. Right. So yeah.
So I'm going to jump in and do my best to attempt to explore how I understand your work.
Yeah.
So when I first came into contact with you in 2015, what I was looking at was very exciting to me in terms of pattern language for systemic transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course, you know, I feel this transformation that's happening on the planet, and that's what consumes my attention. So I had been in contact with pattern language before, but I didn't really understand it until I looked a bit more into it after seeing your work. So some of what I understand and what I'm excited about is in looking for patterns and in understanding the patterns that exist, it allows for this systemic understanding to arise, and that there is it's like there's a supra intelligence that is weaving all around us, and the patterns allow us to see that somehow in all of the ways that it expresses. And so what I'm most excited about in your work is the turning of the attention to the patterns that connect, as your current piece of work is exploring, so that the information flows, the learning, the modeling, and the continued development of systemic transformation can be accelerated.
Yes.
First seen, explored, and then accelerated. And so yeah, I just wanted to, as best as I can, land on the heartbeat of what's so exciting to me about what you've been working on, Helene.
Yeah, that's it. It's seeing, and it's accelerating what's good and changing what's not so good, but also measuring the acceleration of what's good, as I was referring to. But you're talking about supra. You didn't say intelligence. You used another term.
I can't remember. It's in the
supra something, but you said supra something. But I'm wondering whether, and that's another discussion, whether it's supra and transcending, or whether it's intra.
Ooh.
Whether it's within things, because the pattern is within our brain, the pattern is within our body, the pattern is within, the universe, the nature, the cosmos, and the pattern that connects is not God that's going to connect. I mean, I shouldn't take this example, but it's not some supra
all-knowing
thing that will connect everything. It's there inside things. It's there in the way things unfold, actually, and so it's as much, or maybe more, looking into things and the source of things than looking at things that are overarching or above things, and that's maybe what makes it powerful in a certain way, because it's there in every little thing that you are going to look at. So you don't need to agree and spend hours to create a consensus, or to find all these elements of universality in order to describe them and express them. Maybe, and that's another discussion I'm having in the system sciences community, that with general systems theory, there's been a quest for general systems principles and universal principles that are transversal to all sciences, and they've been hitting walls for decades, because they never managed to get to these universals. And the more they find examples of the universals, and that's one of the systems philosophers, David Russo, that writes that the more you find examples of these manifestations or instantiations of these universal patterns, the more you know they're there, but the less you're able to formulate them. And so one of my ideas in connection to the patterns that connect is that with all the semantic technologies that we have, well, maybe we could find all these instances and say, well, are they equal or not equal? How similar are they? They're similar on this dimension, but not similar on that dimensions, and create discussions on these patterns that we each see. You know, I see it like this, you see it like that. Well, on this point, there's a connection, they overlap, but on that point, they're different. What is it? Is it the context, not the context? And if we manage to pull, you know, to connect dots between all these patterns or group of patterns, well, maybe we're going to generate clouds of more or less similar patterns with a distance and a proximity between all these similar analog or instantiation. And the actual universal pattern maybe will emerge from this proximity between all these things, or at least we can say, well, I can't give you the formulation of the universal pattern, but here, that's the blob of what it could look like, and that's the fuzzy thing that kinds of, you know, encapsulates all the gist or gestalt or whatever of the thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, and it's within. So how can you use the within to create the bigger thing?
I love the intra, and that kind of weaves a little bit back to the people can feel the wholeness, because the wholeness is within us. In terms of, you know, I know that you're embedded in a beautiful network of human beings that are doing amazing work, some of whom I know and some of whom I don't.
And you're part of it.
Here we are.
You are embedded, yes.
Yes. So I'm curious I see that this work in having these kind of deeper dialogues is one way to be able to express, expose, poke at things, be able to share what it is that we're all working on. And so I would love to have, be a part of a large exploration of people's work using this medium. So I'm curious of who in your network, either that you know really well, or because I know that you're obviously working directly with people already. But I would love to hear who you would really love to do some sessions like this with to explore the work. Now, I didn't mention this, but what I would love to do with you is I'd love for, you know, us to, you know, today we're looking at your work, even though I feel that I've only barely scratched the surface, really. I
have also barely scratched the surface.
Yes. And so, yes, I would love to do more follow-ons that are specifically put together to look at the different segments of your work. So that's just on offer. But in terms of these kind of network development pieces, what I was wanting to do with people is do a 3-part series with people and have other people take this and do this as well, which is one where one person approaches another person they're inspired by and does a piece. The second one where the roles are reversed. So you would explore my work and what I'm up to.
Yes, and I'd love to do that and explore the work of different people that can contribute to this type, because actually you're asking me who in my network, but well, I must say that I've been, you know, kind of caught up with lots of different things lately, but I can't really say exactly, you know, can't give you 10 or 20 names like that. It's something that I really need to give it some thought. And I have co-created a group at the Bertalanffy Amphi Center for the study of social science, singular. That's called System Science and Pattern Literacy. And we're actually bringing together people who actually have a piece of a response to that. And I'm yet to, kind of think and who could at the same time, because you have people who are interested, who are working for their own, let's say, field of studies. And it's always interesting to interview them. But if they're not interested in a piece of the whole that you're trying to construct, it will be difficult to enter their field or their sphere in a way where it can resonate and converse and be reflexive. So there's lots of people who are working in all the areas that could be interesting to interview, but I'm really looking for the people who really who have this hook to say, well, I want to hook to these others in order to build a greater whole, because I'm interested in the whole and I'm interested in interconnecting these pieces. So let's do that together, yes.
So in terms of our pieces, the third piece to do is where our work intersects. And I think one of the things that I've understood is that it takes a full hour or more to really get a sense of someone's work. And that's actually a short amount of time to really take in the breadth of a lifetime of work. But that space between us, I think, is really exciting in terms of the patterns that connect.
Yes, and you've pointed out interesting, areas of focus in the group discussion that we had this morning. So I'm interested to explore that too. But I'm also, in people who will be looking at this video, if you feel that you're part of the people who have a very, a domain that's connected to it and who want to connect this domain to all others to explore this, please, we're here.
Yes. So off the top of my head, I would love to either be a part of or see a conversation with Neil Davidson.
Yes.
And he is in our group. Arthur Brock and Daniel Harris.
Yes.
Both of those. Michel Bowens. I would love to engage him in this space and see him take this into his own work.
Because Michel has always been very supportive of my work. And he was almost, a catalyst at some point, because one day he kind of sent me the PDF of a book that they had written on how to change capitalism, etc. And I was thinking, hey, you have 5 solid pages to explain a dynamic and to explain this is what I want to change and this is what's going to change. I want to see this, in visual form. I want to have a better grasp of what you want to do. And I really believe that if we could, express the dynamics of peer production, of commons production in terms of patterns, and they're doing it now. I think that they have several initiatives in this direction, and I think Michel is working in this direction. I've kind of lost track of a bit of what has been going on in the past year, but I'd really be interested to see what's been brewing there.
So yes, I'd love for us to kind of make a list and reach out to some people to further develop this work, your work, our work.
Yes, everybody's, yes. And I think desperately in need of tools that can help us see, see where we're going, see big trends, see dynamics, visualization tools, and these tools, they exist, they're there, but they're focusing on very, very edgy stuff, and they are behind high, proprietary walls, to serve, I don't know if we mentioned it already, but yes, I did, consumption, I mean, to on our consuming behaviors. They're directed to our capitalistic behaviors and not to our best,
human
endeavors and behaviors.
Yes. Sorry, the cat asked to be let out.
Okay. So now we see the bull.
Yes.
Or the dragon bull.
Yes. Yes. And so I'm excited about following this path and seeing what emerges. Another sense I have is that no matter who is in the circle, if we hold the space in a certain way where people feel welcome to share their perspective, ask a question, participate fully, that demonstration of peership is of its own a pattern that needs to be set in motion and shared and shown and developed. For example, the images that Neil puts together in terms of layering information.
They're incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then Harry Vandervelde, who you met today, his work as well is brilliant.
Yes, there's a something like the graphs, and he has semantic layers on it, and I really am looking forward to hear more about it.
Yeah. So we have a lot of brilliance to explore. Earlier today, I was thinking, really what this work is about mining human potential. And then I thought, well, mining. But it's more accurately, I think, seeing in a way that is active.
But as we were saying, there's no bad words. There's just, mining, a little mining, mining what's good.
Mm-hmm.
Is not a bad thing. It's depleting. It's extorting. It's a little dose of everything. Gets the world going. So I think that when we become wise, we know when to stop. We know the dose, like a medicine.
Right.
Medicine. We know the dose where it's going to make us better, and the dose at which no stop now.
Yes.
See, like Bitcoin, it was a new form of mining, so they used this word, but it kind of, it did evolve. There was no limit, or there is no limit.
Yeah, and there's some challenges that arise with that in terms of expending power. And I'm really excited about Arthur Brock's work in terms of the sovereign accountable commons and sort of mitigating that need to expend that power. So I'll plant one other seed that I'm excited to share with you. And I know that you're coming here to Vancouver in a couple of days.
Yes, we need to keep topics of conversation. We'll have lots of topics of conversation.
Yes, and I'm excited for that. And I'm also I know that we won't necessarily capture what we learn and share together. So I want to plant a seed to do a piece with you about the alphabet code.
Yes, because this was one thing. Yes, you talked about that. And I thought, hey, I never heard of that. Why didn't she never tell me about it? And let's do that. Because I was very intrigued. And it's a code, so I'm very interested. So probably it has lots of ramifications that resonate, that meet my own ramifications.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. So happy to plant that seed.
Okay. So I'll interview you maybe.
That sounds great.
Okay.
So thank you. Is there any kind of final, I know that I feel like we could have gone much deeper into your work, but this was a great grounding.
Yes, I think, we covered lots.
And is there anything you'd like to kind of plant a seed yourself in terms of where you're going and what kind of participation you're looking at from others?
Well, I think it seems to me I planted lots of seeds, but maybe not seeds that kind of, get people to. Of course, I mean, the idea is to work with people who want to bring their individual, identity within a quest for something bigger, and a quest for finding this way of interconnecting or federating or constellating things that keep their independence, but that synergize and create synergetic effects. So if you feel drawn by this type of research and discourse, and you have bricks to bring in theory or in practice or in technology, well, yes, please contact me. There are many. I mean, there are many avenues. There's the Global Challenge Facebook group, but I have a PLAST, Pattern Languages for Systemic Transformation Facebook page, and yes, different avenues where we can connect and see what we can share.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Helene. I very much look forward to our continued exploration and development.
Thank you.